Judge Gordon decides the case of Buck v. Priddy at the Amherst County Courthouse a month after Albert Priddy's death from Hodgkin disease. Priddy is replaced by eugenicist Dr. John Bell as superintendent of the State Colony of Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Bell pushes the newly named case, Buck v. Bell, to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, where the constitutionality of the Virginia sterilization law is upheld once again. The case of Buck v. Bell is then officially heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. The year is now 1927, and a final decision to the turbulent case is about to be made in the U.S. Supreme Court as Carrie Buck battles for her reproductive rights. Briefs from both sides are to be heard. Aubrey Strode presenting his long and detailed brief.
Regarding the case of Buck v. Bell, I present three main arguments. Virginia's sterilization law does not impose any cruel and unusual punishment. The law affords inmates due process of law, and it ultimately embodies a valid exercise of police power aimed at protecting the health and safety of the public. Buck's sterilization would be painless and beneficial to both society and her quality of life. Additionally, Buck was offered notice of the procedure, granted access to legal representation, protected by the State Board, and afforded the right to appeal.
Strode's detailed brief to the U.S. Supreme Court assumes a fair trial has been granted to Carrie Buck. However, that is not the case, as her right to legal counsel was ultimately obstructed by Irving Whitehead's collusion with Aubrey Strode. Next, Whitehead delivers his inadequate brief, evidently throwing the case in favor of eugenics and sterilization. These circumstances will be reflected in the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Irving Whitehead, presenting his brief less than half as long as Strode's.
I conceded that Carrie Buck is indeed feeble-minded and her child as well. However, in view of the 14th Amendment, sterilizing Buck would deprive her of her bodily integrity. Sterilizing the feeble-minded is just trying to rid society of those deemed undesirable.
The U.S. Supreme Court hears these oral arguments and makes an 8-1 decision upholding Carrie Buck's compulsory eugenics-based sterilization and the law authorizing it on May 2, 1927. Associate Justice Pierce Butler is the sole dissenting justice, yet he offers no opinion. The majority opinion is written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. This sets a precedent for future legal disputes as the case of Buck v. Bell becomes a landmark U.S. Supreme Court testament of women's reproductive rights, eugenics-based ableism, and obstruction of legal support. Associate Justice Pierce Butler. I dissent.
Within an 8-1 majority vote, we rule in favor of the Virginia statute. Compulsorily Eugene-based sterilization and Carrie Buck's sterilization procedure, the public welfare calls on us. The best citizens for the protection of their lives, we must prevent our being swamped. Being swamped with incompetence. The world is far better off if we prevent those who are unfit from continuing their kind, instead of waiting to execute their degenerate offspring for crime or letting them starve. The principle of compulsory vaccination is sufficient enough to cover the cutting of fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
With Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' speech, the decision of 8-1 is made. Following suit with the corrupt decision of Buck v. Bell, 30 other states within the U.S. adopted their own sterilization laws by 1930. Eugenics gained prominence through the philosophies of notable public figures such as Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, John Maynard Keynes, and Adolf Hitler. Carrie Buck was ultimately sterilized by John Bell on October 19, 1927. The case set a core precedent as the 1927 decision and sterilization allowed women engaging in non-marital sex and deviance to be labeled as sexually delinquent. Women labeled as sexually delinquent would be deemed unfit to produce. This decision ultimately led to several states expanding their eugenics programs until the 1980s, when compulsory eugenics-based sterilization procedures were stopped. Yet, by this time, more than enough damage had already been done. More than 7,000 people were sterilized in Virginia, more than 8,000 in North Carolina, and 20,000 in California. The lasting impact of landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell was felt throughout the 20th century and continues to be a reminder today of the importance of advocating for justice and equality.